Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Jessica Reed Krause has described and defined one of the most underestimated aspects in the Idaho student murders case. What do you think that is? It is the number 9 clue that we've all missed. Now, if I could beam myself onto King Road in Moscow, Idaho, if I could do that right now, I would probably end up investigating the town, the neighborhood, and the area around the house, much as Jessica Reed Krause has done. She's written an article, it came out about 6 days ago, Moscow in Mourning. She spent 3 days inside the small town at the center of what she refers to as a viral tragedy. I would do the same thing she did. I would take photographs, not the way so many of the reporters have done, standing in the same place, but instead get a different perspective, get a proper sense of the scale. Looking at the funhouse, looking at 112 to King Road from the perspective of another house that is there. What is the setting of the house, for example, vis-a-vis neighboring structures? But the most important thing I'd want to know is a far more subtle thing. It's something that you can't see and you can't photograph. It's something that's felt and experienced. You know what that is? And this is the number 9 clue we've all missed. It's the culture. It's the culture of the town. It's the culture of the area. It's the culture also obviously of the university. And Jessica has done a great job nailing that part down too. How is the culture in Washington, Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho, different from Albrightsville, Pennsylvania? Is it different? If it is different, how is it different? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. How is the culture of someone in one particular place different to the culture of a person in another place? And what happens if there's a culture clash? Are there different cultures at different universities? And what happens when they don't reconcile? In terms of this episode, if you're enjoying the coverage here, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So I have attended different campuses. I attended one university and also went to an advertising school. I actually wanted to study law at the University of Cape Town, but they didn't have the degree that I wanted, and so I had to go to another very good university in terms of its law faculty. But I really missed out on, I think, a wonderful student life. And so the question is, what is the culture like in Moscow and also Pullman? And how did Brian Koberger experience that culture shift, or even perhaps a culture shock? I've lived, for example, in South Korea, where everything is totally different, and that is one potential way you can feel isolated and lonely and miserable, is if you are in a culture that you're either struggling to connect with, or a culture that perhaps you disagree with or disagrees with you. Now, one thing that I noticed in some of the comments, some of the notes that Koberger made on Hayden Stinchfield's assignments had to do with Roe v. Wade. And you can imagine that that is a very divisive political but also legal aspect that these students were thinking about. And you may or may not be aware that the University of Idaho paid $90,000 to 3 Christians and a professor who were issued no contact orders. This was about a month after the crime. That lawsuit stemmed from orders issued by the university to 3 students and the professor, directing them to have no contact with a female lesbian-identified student who was upset by the response she received when she asked the students why CLS required its officers to affirm that marriage is between one man and one woman. So you can see that you kind of have that sort of thing playing out as well on the sort of platform of the university. Some of these political thoughts manifesting in a particular way. So according to the Associated Press, the University of Idaho settled students' free speech lawsuit. So you can see, just in terms of this area of sexual orientation, there is this feeling of insistence of the right to free speech. That is the sort of political atmosphere that was sort of playing out in Moscow at the time that all of this happened. Now, coming back to Jessica Reed Krause, she spent a couple of days in Moscow, and she did a great job nailing down the culture of the town. She writes the following, quote, "An online introduction deems Moscow the heart of the arts. When asked why to visit, it answers, Moscow is nestled in the heart of some of Idaho's most scenic mountains. It overlooks rolling hills and enjoys some of the most beautiful sunsets in the northwest. Moscow is a very liberal community, often honored by visiting authors, festivals, and plenty of local talent," end quote. So there you really have it in a nutshell. Moscow's very liberal. I think Pullman is quite liberal as well. And then you've got to ask the question, well, is the community that Koberger comes from also liberal, also as liberal? And then Jessica Reed Krause also writes, quote, "Or as the creative writing professor who would meet us at a local dive bar described, it's the place where people go to get weird," end quote. Now, I think there's a difference between Brian's weird and the weird of, say, Xana and Ethan and Kaylee and Maddie and some of the other students like Hayden Stinchfield. You kind of get the idea that their weird is more weird than Brian's weird. You might even have some students experimenting with same-sex scenarios, I guess. Anyway, Jessica Reed Krause continues. She says, "Moscow is weird, but maybe in the way that all small towns are weird, especially for those of us not from or familiar with them. Like most small college towns, a liberal hub with quaint but peculiar undertones." So, if you don't know, Moscow was established in 1888 and has a current population of 25,000. I have an idea I would enjoy Moscow, but I'm not sure Brian is the right person for it. He seems not to have an artistic bone in his body. He seems to be quite a rigid sort of person who's more interested in an academic and theoretical experience of things than a sort of a living, artistic, intuitive sense of things. Now, I've been describing Brian for a while as ANAL, or simply as a fairly rigid fellow with a fairly narrow view of the world. Well, Moscow is the opposite: liberal, broad-minded, generous, loose and free. The funhouse is in a way the epitome of this fluid, spontaneous cultural mindset, whereas former security guard Brian himself is an anathema to all of that. He seems to be a blue-collar kid trying to settle into a weird, perhaps snooty, white-collar town. No wonder he feels inferior and emasculated. Because there is a status quo situation developing, and due to Brian's strange and incompatible attitudes, incompatible to the local status quo, he's sort of isolated. But that is what he's used to. That is his default setting. And so in a situation like that, you stay true to yourself and roll with the punches, or you take the attitude, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. What do you think Brian did? Brian seems to have taken the position, when in Rome, remember that you're a Gaul, stick to your guns and make sure everyone knows just how rigid your superior wisdom is. How far do you think that is going to get you? How far do you think anyone will get with that approach in a liberal setting? And it does seem as though Brian ran afoul of the sort of standards and codes and norms and culture pretty quickly once they encountered him and he encountered them. So if that seems like a weird assessment, think about just this idea of blue collar. Think about how blue collar the crime itself is. Moscow as a whole is a sort of white collar crime sort of place. What's the difference? White collar crime is non-violent, generally, whereas the currency of blue collar crime may tend to be more violent. Not that crime doesn't occasionally color outside of these lines and definitions. But when we think about white-collar crime, we think about insider trading, money laundering, tax evasion, embezzlement, identity theft, Ponzi schemes, all that kind of thing. But when you think about blue-collar crime, we think about violent crimes, drug crimes, sex crimes, including crimes that occur on college campuses. And so isn't there a little bit of a sense of Brian as a blue-collar fellow that is trying to emerge in a sort of white-collar culture? And isn't that where he sort of ran into trouble? And then the question arises, did he then revert to a sort of blue-collar way of dealing with things? What do you guys think of that assessment? The cultural environment is kind of like a psychological geography. You know, you live in a particular place and the environment does affect you. And it's really interesting looking at the topography, the Pocono Hills of Pennsylvania, and comparing that to the also rolling hillsides in Washington State and Idaho, but they're different. One thing that is quite idiosyncratic to the city of Pullman, the surrounding geography, is that it's situated across several Loess hills. And this kind of sand dune type geography of windblown sediment was set down over a period of about 1 million years, right? And so what impact does this actual geography have on the human mind? You've got these major hills, Military Hill, Pioneer Hill, Sunnyside Hill, College Hill, and then Snake River, sort of snaking between all of that, between these watersheds. How can the geography lead to a kind of culture, kind of attitude to the world that sort of gravitates in a particular direction, almost like water rolling down a hillside? And I don't think you've got to be super kind of scientific about it. I don't think you need to be a psychologist just to get a sense that in this different geographical and topographical area, in which is also there's a psychological and cultural change and shift from what Brian has been used to. He's lived his entire life in that Pocono Hills area of Pennsylvania. And so what happened when he came here? What happened when he came to these hills around Pullman? Isn't the answer that he got lost? He got lost in the hills and he got lost in the woods. He came here to make a living, to find himself, to become someone, only for the opposite to happen. He lost who he was. He lost his way. And you can only have that conversation in an authentic way when you're thinking about the reality of how these places are different and why it might be quite difficult for someone who's socially awkward to navigate some of those cultural differences. And the fact that it's physically different as well, the landscape's also slightly different, may add to that sense of dislocation, psychological disorientation. And what does one do with those feelings of anxiety and lack of direction and just feeling lost? Doesn't one turn to a substance to soothe that sense of restless rootlessness, of not being anchored to anyone? You know, which is how one feels when one is lost. And when you're in a lost situation like that and everyone around you doesn't want really to talk to you, doesn't really want your friendship, doesn't it actually seem like quite a hostile environment? Somewhere that actually looks pleasant, but that actually locks you out, actually feels cruel and unpleasant. And does that then not stir the criminal psychology? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.